Watch until the end to see how this seemingly accidental situation of a bored guy waking up is responsible for the integrity of this important space mission. The modern Adam and Eve story that will keep you on the edge of your seat is a drama movie called Passengers. Spoilers ahead, and let's dive right in. The Avalon spaceship is cruising through space, making its way to a place called Homestead 2, a world that's already been settled. Nobody's hanging around in the rooms. The ship's just cruising along by itself. All 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers are snoozing in their hibernation pods. Then, out of the blue, the ship cruises into an asteroid belt which starts messing with its shields. They quickly shift power to the main shield, but there's a problem. They're heading straight for a massive asteroid. Out of nowhere, the asteroid slams into the ship, setting off all sorts of problems. While the ship starts fixing itself up, one of the hibernation pods springs to life. The lucky soul roused from their deep sleep is Jim Preston, a mechanical whiz. As he groggily wakes up, an automated voice fills him in. He's been out cold for 120 years, but they're just 4 months from reaching Homestead 2. They assure him he'll get to kick back and enjoy all the fancy perks of the ship. Jim gets the lowdown on his ID band, cabin, and the fun stuff he's supposed to do before they make an arrival on the planet. Feeling both pumped up and jittery to mingle with the folks on board, he gears up, steps out of his cabin, and joins a class run by a hologram for a full learning session. Jim appears a bit anxious as the hologram talks about Earth, labeling it as overcrowded, overpriced, and overhyped. I must agree with the hologram on this one. The hologram instructs him to save his questions for the end of the lesson, but Jim persists in asking why he's the sole attendee. Recognizing the hologram's inability to respond, he ventures off to seek out other individuals. Upon reaching the ship's main concourse, he finds it deserted, yet an automated information desk stands ready to provide assistance. Jim requests to converse with a human attendant and is directed to speak with a steward. However, upon discovering the absence of any personnel, he seeks to communicate with the captain. Upon reaching the bridge, although he lacks access to enter, he sees that none of the primary crew members are awake. Jim later visits the observatory and discovers that the ship is in fact 90 years from reaching Homestead 2. He realizes that he woke up too early. He hurries back to the concourse and sends a message to Earth seeking guidance on what to do next, as he is unsure how to return to hibernation. The communication system notifies him that reaching Earth via call would take about 55 years to receive a response. As always, the overpriced, overhyped, and overcrowded Earth lets us all down. Jim feels crushed by this news. He wanders around and eventually finds himself in the ship's bar, where he encounters another person. While conversing with the bartender, Jim senses something peculiar about him. As he goes to fetch a drink, Jim realizes that the individual is actually only an android named Arthur. Curious, Jim seeks out some more information from him, but he struggles to comprehend how Jim could be present ahead of schedule. The next day, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cantina. He soon notices that the menu predominantly offers choices exclusively for gold passengers. Settling for a simple coffee, he contemplates how to repair his hibernation chamber. Once he gathers all the necessary tools, he successfully gets it working and then lies down inside the pod. However, there's no change. Afterwards, he attempts to utilize the tools to access the crew's hibernation chambers, but that also proves unsuccessful. Meanwhile, minor glitches occur throughout the ship. Jim frequently visits the bar for drinks, often engaging in conversation with Arthur. Encouraged by the android's advice, he decides to sneak into one of the gold classrooms to enjoy himself aboard the ships. Jim explores various amenities such as restaurants, games, and the entertainment system. I guess it's not that fun when you don't have someone to play with. As time goes by, Jim grows increasingly unhappy being alone on the ship. One day, after getting drunk, he aimlessly wanders around the hibernation pods and accidentally discovers an airlock containing spacesuits for spacewalks. Jim decides to put on a suit, enters the airlock, and activates the release mechanism for the door. Exiting the ship, Jim is captivated by the vastness of space. Knowing he's the sole awake individual beholding such a sight, he disengages the magnets securing his boots and drifts weightlessly, overwhelmed by sadness. Returning inside, he takes off the spacesuit, but later returns to the airlock bare. He almost pulls the lever, prepared to end everything. But at the final instant, he has a change of heart, rushing back inside only to stumble over a bottle. Upon rising, his attention is immediately captured by a woman named Aurora in one of the pods. Delving into the directory, he hunts for her files and listens intensely to her passenger interview, feeling a growing fondness for her. I would also be mesmerized if I saw Jennifer Lawrence, so I can't blame him. Afterward, he's spotted sitting beside her pod, continuing to listen to her interviews. Returning to the bar, he reads through some of her writings and engages Arthur in conversation about her work. He becomes fixated on the irony of his circumstance, venturing to another world for a brighter future, awaking prematurely and missing the mark, and discovering his ideal partner, only to find her beyond his grasp. Jim can't stop pondering her and begins to contemplate the idea of awakening her as well. He discusses it with the android, but the android fails to grasp the dilemma. If Jim were to wake her up solely for his own sake, he'd essentially be trapping her there with him, stranded on the ship. Initially, Jim decides against the idea, but over time, he finds himself unable to shake it off. Then, one day, he has a change of heart. He heads to her pod and successfully activates it. As she begins to awaken, going through the same routine he did, he retreats to his room, hiding out of sight. After some time, he ventures to the main concourse in the hope of encountering her, and to his surprise, there she stands, equally bewildered as he once was a year prior. He must feel so bad and so good simultaneously. Jim informs her that they're the sole individuals who are awake and guides her to the observatory. There, he reveals to her that he lacks access to both the crew and the primary controls of the ship. Aurora panics and insists on returning to her pod. When they reach it, Jim clarifies that there's no specific gear available to return them to hibernation, essentially revealing their predicament: stranded. Returning to the concourse, he advises her to rest after awakening from hibernation. Feeling sympathy for Jim, who has spent over a year alone on the ship, she expresses her remorse. Jim returns to the bar, filled with regret over his actions. He requests Arthur to keep quiet about being the one who woke Aurora up. The following day, Aurora awakens and heads to the concourse to inquire about the hibernation pods using the automated info desk. Jim accompanies her and they proceed to get breakfast. As they depart, the info desk experiences a malfunction of some kind. In the cantina, Aurora notices that Jim has been having the same breakfast for over a year now and decides to get him a menu from the gold class. They discuss the potential to repair the pods, but while Jim is hesitant, Aurora remains determined. She explores the infirmary and sifts through the research documents, eventually making her way to the crew's hibernation quarters in an attempt to open the doors. Meanwhile, Jim observes more malfunctions occurring across the ship. After a while, Aurora reflects on her life aboard the Avalon. She spends her time writing, jogging around the ship, and swimming in the pool, gradually becoming more conscious of her circumstances. Curious about Jim's story, she visits the cantina to interview him, hoping for an intriguing tale. She inquires about his reasons for immigrating to the colony, and while Jim initially responds with company slogans, he later shares his deeper desire to establish himself and create a meaningful life on the new world. Eventually, they find themselves in the observatory, where Aurora finally reveals her purpose for being there. She's got a round-trip ticket unlike the others. Her plan was to visit Homestead 2, spend a year there, and return to Earth to become the first journalist to do so, crafting an amazing tale. As Aurora loses hope in finding a solution, Jim tries to lift her spirits. He takes her dancing, to the movies, and even to play basketball. Finally, they visit the bar to meet Arthur, but her worries soon return. I can't believe that his ludicrous plan is actually working. After being left alone with the android, Jim is filled with guilt over his actions towards Aurora. Moments later, he's seen fixing something, while Aurora discovers a miniature Chrysler building he crafted for her in the observatory. Later, they enjoy a date at the bar, sharing stories over dinner. Aurora opens up about losing her father during her teenage years. Following dinner, they venture to the airlock and don spacesuits together. They embark on a spacewalk together, marking a memorable moment for Jim to share with someone. With the magnetic boots turned off, they float together in the vastness of space. Upon returning inside, they share a kiss, then head to Jim's cabin where they spend the night together. From then on, they begin living as a couple, with Aurora moving into Jim's cabin. They share various activities, such as jogging, eating, and sleeping together. Jim also discovers the ship's hydroponics bay and surprises Aurora with flowers. One day, as the ship passes a red giant, they head to the observatory to catch a glimpse of it. It also happens to be Aurora's birthday, so later that night they celebrate in one of the ship's restaurants, then at the bar. While Jim prepares a ring for Aurora in the washroom, she stays at the bar to chatter with Arthur. In an unexpected turn, Arthur inadvertently reveals to Aurora that Jim woke her up intentionally, which shocks her to the core. I couldn't believe that the android snitched. When Jim returns, Aurora confronts him in disbelief and anger before fleeing in panic. Jim returns to his cabin to find all of Aurora's belongings gone. The next day, he encounters her in the cantina, but she promptly flees upon seeing him. Aurora reaches a breaking point. One night, consumed by desperation, she storms into Jim's cabin, expressing her rage through punches and kicks, fueled by the desire to end his life. Despite her attempts to avoid him, Jim tries to reason with her over the communication system, apologizing and attempting to explain his actions. He confesses his love for her, but Aurora remains unmoved, unable to forgive him for the choice he made to disrupt her life. I mean, I feel like anyone would doom someone's life in a moment of weakness, right? One night, while Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction occurs on the ship. ship. It experiences a critical error, leading to the shutdown of the main command system. Shortly after, Jim encounters a malfunctioning elevator as he moves around the ship. Meanwhile, Aurora ventures into the main concourse and discovers that Jim has planted a tree there. Later, she heads to the cantina, only to find that the food dispensary is also experiencing malfunctions. Suddenly, they both hear the voice of the deck chief over the communication system, inquiring about the origin of the tree. Rushing to the concourse, they find Gus Mancuso standing by Jim's tree. They exchange introductions and brief the captain about the issues. He's puzzled about the failure of 3 pods. Mancuso escorts them to the bridge, where he realizes that the ship has some problems, but the system data needs manual verification. As they exit the bridge, they narrowly avoid a falling robot, prompting Jim and Aurora to inform Mancuso about the increasing frequency of malfunctions across the ship. Mancuso acknowledges the seriousness of the situation, explaining the protocol for collecting data. Mancuso inspects the pods, and Jim joins him. Having deduced the issue with Aurora's pod, the chief regards Jim's actions as disgraceful. Later at the bridge, as Mancuso reviews the data, Aurora approaches. They discover her pod situation, and he informs her that he's unable to fix it. Jim enters with the 16th malfunctioning robot. Mancuso, feeling unwell from hibernation sickness, heads to rest, but as he leaves, he coughs up blood. That evening, Aurora struggles to sleep, prompting her to take a swim. Unexpectedly, gravity disappears across the ship, causing her to nearly drown as the water moves unpredictably. Fortunately, the gravity is restored just in time for her to escape. Talk about bad timing for a swim. Meanwhile, Jim and Aurora coincidentally cross paths while seeking Mancuso. Together, they return to the bridge, where they gradually uncover the ship's ongoing issues. Mancuso deduces that a significant system failure occurred 2 years prior, causing the current predicament. They must locate and address the source of the malfunction, since the entire ship is struggling to compensate. If left unresolved, the entire ship could end up stranded. Despite this urgency, they set out to identify the issue. However, Mancuso suddenly collapses, prompting Jim and Aurora to rush him to the infirmary for medical attention. Mancuso's condition is terminal, and there's no medical intervention available to extend his life. Eventually, they convene in the observatory, where Mancuso hands Jim his ID bracelet, urging them to repair the ship before passing away. Suddenly, the ship's lighting switches to a distressing red hue, accompanied by tremors coursing through the vessel. Jim asks for Aurora's assistance, and together they rush toward engineering, but they encounter another malfunction in the gravity drive, followed by another one affecting Arthur. Jim decides to deactivate Arthur. Eventually, they reach engineering and begin searching for the source of the problem. They locate it in the power plant, and as they open the hatch, Aurora is pulled inside. Actually, if you think about it, if he hadn't woken her up, they would all be doomed, so he kinda saved everybody's life. The collision with the asteroid creates a hole in the hull in that part of the ship. Jim is also pulled toward the breach, but he manages to grab onto the hatch as it starts closing. Eventually, he gets sucked in, but they promptly seal the hatch. Immediately after resolving the issue, Jim notices that there are multiple breaches in the hull. They track the path of the meteor and discover that it struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can locate replacement parts for it. After finding the necessary component and replacing it, they attempt to vent the reactor, but the manual process proves unsuccessful. Jim realizes that he has to open the vent door from outside the ship to cool down the reactor. They both head to the airlock, and as Jim prepares to go out, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet because there's a chance he won't return. With Aurora's assistance, he dons the suit, and as he steps into the airlock, she pleads with him to return because she can't bear to stay on the ship without him. Riz. Aurora returns to the reactor, where the temperature has reached dangerous levels. A piece from the reactor shoots into her arm as Jim approaches the vent from the outside and locates the door. As he attempts to bypass the vent to open it, the temperature continues to climb in the reactor room. He soon understands that he'll need to keep the reactor door open by hand, so the reactor can't release its pressure, and he informs Aurora. She's reluctant about the idea, but he persists, emphasizing the importance of saving the other people on the ship. Despite her concerns about his safety, she ultimately agrees, and she initiates the venting process for the reactor. This kind of reminds me of that scene in Endgame when Thor is holding onto the hatch to make his axe. The plan works, but the fumes from the reactor force Jim back and snap his tether. His suit pressure is decreasing, and he informs Aurora about the situation. She rushes to find another suit to bring him in. Despite his apologies, she swiftly dons a suit and flies out to rescue him. However, her tether falls short. Despite this setback, she grabs onto his tether and successfully pulls him back in. Aurora rushes Jim to the infirmary, only to discover he's already passed away. Acting quickly, she uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and revive him. The medical pod takes over and successfully brings Jim back to life. Aurora forgives him. Afterwards, Aurora repairs Arthur, and together they conduct a respectful space burial for Mancuso. Jim leads her to the infirmary and shares his discovery. He's figured out how to repurpose the medical pod as a hibernation chamber. He suggests she enter the pod and complete the journey in hibernation. However, she doesn't want to, and remains awake on the ship with him, as if he wouldn't just wake her up again if she accepted. After Jim proposes to her, they spend the rest of their lives together on the ship. 88 years later, when the Avalon reaches Homestead 2, the crew awakens to a surprising sight. The ship isn't as they left it. Aurora leaves them a message, recounting the life she and Jim shared on the ship, while the others were in hibernation. I wonder how this movie would have turned out if Aurora was the one to have been woken up first. Would she choose our main protagonist Jim to help her save the spacecraft? Maybe it would turn out completely differently. I rate this movie a solid 8 out of 10. What are your thoughts?
Looks like this movie pill is starting to wear off. But don't worry, there's always more where that came from. Tap here to keep the effects going with this next movie, because who can stop at just one? And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe, because your next movie dose is just a click away.